Thank you. My name is Steve Brown. I'm currently the manager of the Rapid Transit Office in the City of Vancouver. But for today's discussion, my past experience with the 15 years that I've been at the city is kind of more relevant because I've been involved with Powell Street Overpass project. I led the development of the corridor assessment from Falls Creek Flats to the waterfront, and I've been involved with a number of funding discussions with partners. So I'm just going to give you a bit of an overview of that. So my presentation today will give a little bit of a further drill down on the capital planning as it applies to transportation. I'll talk about some of our funding partners and what they would be looking for in these types of projects, and then give two examples. One is the Powell Street Overpass project, and then the other one is the Broadway Subway. So on the funding and the capital plan, Kate mentioned that this next 4-year plan is our biggest capital plan ever, $2.8 billion. If you look at what the city delivers within that, it's about 2.2, and then if you drill down into transportation, it's about 311 million in transportation, and that's split between that the repair and maintain, which is about 160 million, and the new infrastructure, which is about 150. So the repair and maintain is really driven by asset condition and where you have to replace those things sooner. And the new infrastructure is driven by things like our Transportation 2040 plan. And so that would prioritize areas that have big increases to accommodating the travel of people. So our mode share targets of people moving around by walk, biking, or transit to accommodate that growth. And the other aspect is improving safety. So those are two kind of big overarching goals out of our Transportation 2040 plan. So when you look at that, 4 years, 311 million split amongst those two things, and you look at the potential cost of this project being 100 to 400 million, there's no way the city can deliver that on our own. So any major project of that kind of scale would completely wipe out our full transportation capital plan, and so it's just not a reality for us to be able to do that. And so what that means is that we need to look at funding partners. So who can those be? So looking at past projects, the federal government, for Powell Street it was Transport Canada, for Broadway Subway it was the federal government through another agency. The province, typically they fund transit and highway projects, so this wouldn't really fall into a highway project because it's away from that, so there's a question of whether we would be able to access funding through there or not. TransLink, we partner with them all the time. They look after the major road network and transit, so they are definitely one that could be a potential funding partner. The Port of Vancouver, they look at goods movement for rail and truck, and this being that rail corridor would be one that they would definitely be at the table. And rail partners, so the Burrard Inlet rail corridor that runs from the Falls Creek Flats to the waterfront is owned by BNSF, but primarily CN is the one that operates on there. So those are two rail agencies that we would look at. And the key thing for them is when you start going into these funding discussions, you have to have a really good defined project. So right now, having 4 options is not a defined project. We don't know what the costs are. The ranges of 100 to 400 million. It's really hard to have the discussions about who's covering what. You need to understand the limitations of the funding partners. So like the federal government, they cannot contribute to property. So I'll give you an example in Powell Street of how that landed. Also the potential benefits. So if you can really nail down what the benefits are each of the party, that tends to lead into some of those splits in the funding. Projects typically need to have a positive business case. If they don't, then that's where they'll start looking at cutting elements out, or individual agencies that have those additional items may have to fund those directly. And the biggest thing too is cost estimates have a shelf life. So typically what you do is you anticipate the year that you're going to do construction, you try and estimate into that time frame, but when you start looking at things that can change, the Canadian dollar rate, interest rates, where are your materials coming from? Are they sourced within Canada or are they sourced elsewhere? Those sorts of things can make a big impact on your costs. And just for an example, in the Broadway Subway, every month or every week that's delayed adds about $1 million in cost to that project. So now that we have that fully funded, we know that it's locked down and you've got a year of delivery, but if we kept on putting that off, significant cost escalations can happen. So let's look at some examples. The Powell Street Overpass. This chart just kind of shows the area that we're talking about today is in here. Powell Street is right to the north of that alignment. It is right along the waterfront. So we won't get into the details of the full corridor, but just to give you some context there. And that project discussion started back in about 2003. At that point, there was a regional rail assessment to find where the bottlenecks were, and they identified Powell Street as one of the #1 areas in the region for rail. In 2006 and 2008, that's when the city started applying for funding for the rail corridor. The interesting thing was at that point, we didn't have the strategy in place. We were just starting that, so our applications were actually quite weak, but we wanted to let the federal government know that we're very interested. And so it wasn't really until 2008, 2009 when the port actually did a South Area trade assessment, and that's where he found that rather than the BI lane corridor, it's the east-west corridor that was really important for them. And once they assessed that, they could see the benefits, they looked at the costs, we started to fund the project, and that's where our partners started to become interested. So in about 2009, we locked down the funding agreements. In 2010, we worked with TransLink to get them able to fund to it. And so really on that project, north is this way on this chart, and you've got the rail corridor and you've got Powell Street. So what it meant for the Powell Street was we shifted it south to allow more room for additional rail in there, and also protected for the future BI line corridor. So there was 3 things there, but really for the port, it was that east-west corridor, because that's where the big movement was happening at that time. There wasn't a lot of movement along the BI line. Now that's increased quite a bit more, so there's definitely a bigger business case on elements going there. So the port, when they looked at it, they were able to pull together the business case. Key things that you have on this, there's financial elements, there's economic impact, customer service, environmental, and social inclusion. Some of these can be quantified, some of them are qualitative, but they're all key aspects of that. And anything that the port is involved with also has to have a security review. So this chart here just gives you kind of a sense of like the elements that are in the business case. The costing is on this side, but really that's the key element that they really look for, the benefit cost ratio. So 1.7 was what that one came out to, so that's why all the partners were interested. And so this slide, you have it in your package, but there was something missing. The rail component was missing on here, so I've updated that. And when you start looking at how this project came together, the Port, Transport Canada, CP Rail were all big funding partners. We brought TransLink in, but the city really only contributed about 7.5% to this project. So it's a $50 million project. The 4.5 million that the rail contributed, and that was CP Rail. So the next one is the Broadway subway. So I'm not going to go over this whole timeline, but basically 2 decades of work to kind of land this, and the key thing of landing it was that it got incorporated into the mayor's vision that was adopted in 2014. So that meant that the 6-kilometer extension, 6 stations could be included into that discussion. And the key thing, really, of having that regional adoption is that they could lobby through the federal election to get transit as a priority. It was identified in the budget specifically. That then meant that they could go to the provincial government through that next election and lobby, and that's where each of the parties put forward the contributions that they were going to do. The city, so this is another one where there's in addition to the slides, city contribution, we provided access to property, secured statutory right-of-ways, and that was valued at $99.8 million. So that's about 3% of the total project's budget of $2.87 billion, just to give you a sense of what the city tends to put into those. So just a summary here of the key takeaways. Whenever we're working with other partners like the federal government, provincial government, they're looking for projects that are shovel-ready, very well defined, and that they can, with strong support from local areas. Big projects can take time to secure funding, and so having that plan in place is really key so that then you can work through those opportunities. The bigger the project, the more regional endorsement you need, so either through the port, TransLink, or others. Projects have to have a positive business case, so we're going to look at reshaping those. And the costs for projects definitely have a shelf life, so we need to make sure that we continually update those. That's the end of my presentation. Excellent. Thank you.